For those of you that don't know, Nikocado Avocado is a YouTuber, right? Who just shocked the internet by revealing that all of videos he's been posting as an overweight mukbang content creator that we assumed were posted in real time were actually stockpiled footage that he's been saving as and since he lost weight, calling it
the greatest social experiment of my entire life.
It's a great time to ask the question, what is the difference between something being just a prank as opposed to a social experiment, and something being a social experiment as opposed to being performance art? And obviously the Venn diagram will inevitably overlap many, many times. But a lot like performance art, the value and the interest to me lies in the way that a statement was made, as opposed to just the value or the novelty of the statement itself. In this case, the execution of the deception was interesting, not necessarily the content of the deception itself. There's this tendency to still think of performance art as something that you go see, right? Like at an art installation that you can buy tickets to. For example, think Marianne Abramovic's performance piece where people lined up to basically sit and make uninterrupted eye contact with her for minutes at a time, or performances that are performed in real time at least and then talked about later. Again, think of Maria Abramovic's performance where she and her lover broke up with each other by starting at different points of the Great Wall of China and then walking past each other to say goodbye. Fun fact, that lover was also one of those people that came and had a silent conversation with her at the particular art exhibit that I just mentioned. It's an interesting watch for sure, however you feel about that performer. But in both of those cases, the point of the art is not necessarily what's interesting, but the way that the point is made. Like, we all know how inadequate words are when it comes to these inarticulatable things that we can express through body language, right? Like, that's so much of communication and just mere eye contact. But performing it and letting people who have the opportunity and like the money to interact and engage with that concept is another thing altogether. Also, try maintaining uninterrupted eye contact with someone for even 1 minute. It's definitely not as easy as you would think. She also had a performance where she was naked and let people choose from a varied selection of tools to use on her as they please. These tools included everything from a gun to a bullet to flowers, etc. And again, the concept of look at the varied ways that humans will react to freedom to harm or not is not radical in and of itself, but it's the execution of that concept. Whether you think that it was a statement on society's hostility towards women or a statement on the inevitable danger of power, it's the performance of it that makes it interesting art. Which brings me to the reason that Nico's grand reveal is interesting, which is because he used the time delay of social media posting as an integral part of the performance itself. He used his doppelganger, if you will, his alternate surrogate digital version of himself to basically work for himself while he lost weight and planned for the ultimate great switcheroo on his audience, which was only possible because of the alternate dimension that we all exist in, which is the internet. And what I mean is that he found a way to bring people to his metaphorical stage for years in real life, because no one's going to buy tickets and come to a museum installation consistently for years, but they will return to social media and the internet on a daily basis. So he found a way to keep people's attention for a prolonged period of time, to keep them buying into the illusion that his digital doppelganger was indeed the real version of himself, and used that programmed eagerness, gullibility, whatever you want to call it, that we all have, to unquestioningly just believe everything we see on the internet, to turn us into the ultimate consumer as opposed to him, which is interesting. It would be like if you were at like a live magic show and someone tried to do a crazy impossible switcheroo, you know, with the same person becoming someone totally different without a body double, which is impossible because humans can't do that. But with the time delay of social media and how we tend to interact with it, you can. And honestly, it's also interesting because the footage of the past versions of himself were still interactive, meaning it wasn't just posting of old videos that created this digital mask he was wearing, but the ability to still interact by commenting. So the footage was like the puppet, if you will, but the live posting nature was what brought it to life and made it seem real. And again, whether or not you think this is all somewhat anticlimactic, which honestly I get, it's kind of like, okay. And it really does make me think about like how enmeshed we are, not only in our own social media avatar's existence in the only metaphorical third space that some of us have that we call the internet, but also how enmeshed we are in each other's presence in this parallel reality that kind of sits on top of the real world, if you will. And on a personal note, as someone who went from touring the country as a healthy Broadway performer to someone who now works from home the majority of the time and is dealing with the joys of chronic illness and autoimmune issues since 2020, not to mention the privileged horrors of normal aging that is the loss of pretty privilege under patriarchy, I philosophically wonder how much of what Nico did was actually deception to begin with, meaning I have endless amounts of footage that I can still use to make reaction thumbnails, repurpose dance TikToks with infographics, you know, outfit of the days, etc., that I could still use now. And I talk all the time about how I feel like I have the phone of someone else from another lifetime that's not relevant to me anymore. Like, I mean, real talk, my life has changed so much since 2020 that the majority of my contacts aren't even relevant anymore. Like the selfies that pop up from just a few years ago, they haunt me when my camera roll tries to suggest that these memory slideshows are still relevant. And I wonder how much of that would be deception if I decided to keep using those. Like, especially as a dancer, singer, actor, I literally have years of footage that I could put to work as a digital alternate version of myself, existing almost as if 2020 never happened. And like, I wonder if I chose to do that, What effect would that have on my psyche, interacting in the world as two very different versions of myself, but still posing as one? And honestly, the fact that Nico was able to keep this a secret for so long is kind of what's impressive to me. It also kind of reminds me of Dali in the way that the value of the art is often contingent upon the perspective of the viewer. Standing directly in front of a painting might look completely different than from a distance, because you'll literally see a different painting from a distance. But instead of distance, Nico used time. Instead of space, he used time, because if you've never heard of Nico till now, this doesn't mean anything to you. But if you've been watching for some time, it does. And it also makes me wonder, especially with how normalized working from home is now compared to like a few years ago, is this not such a clear demonstration of how much more weight our online presence has compared to our actual lives? I think we just need to stop pretending like the internet isn't a real place, because while I understand what people mean when they say that, and I actually don't disagree, that statement is fairly reductive when it comes to acknowledging the exponentially growing real world implications that social media has on our real life compared to our real life. To the point that the destruction of our online presence can mean the end of our real lives when we're talking about reputation, connections, the availability of mutual aid, and the ability just to make an income. We're almost in like a parasocial relationship with ourselves, where we find one not really able to exist without the other. Which would also mean that the very nature of how we think of ourselves as one solitary unit, like the smallest Russian doll of ourself, is changing, right? As opposed to so many different versions of ourself that we all just combine to make one self together, much like internal family systems made manifest in the physical outside as opposed to just conceptually in our own psyche, right? I really recommend reading Doppelganger by Naomi Klein, because she really goes into depth talking about all of the interesting, fascinating intersectionalities and things to consider when it comes to operating from the fissure of one original self, right? Whether it be masking, whether it be code switching, really, really interesting stuff. But it makes me think about how the president of South Korea, Yoon Suk-yeol, was largely elected due to the fact that younger members of his campaign staff created a deep fake AI version of him that was totally out in the open. It was totally transparent, but the point was that this alternate version of the president was able to deliver the same ideas, campaign on the same platform, right? But it was a much more palatable delivery. It was much more clever. It was much more appealing, which therefore ironically made a lot of the younger generation lean in and listen to a lot of the things that he was proposing. But how does that change the moralities and ethics of deception when it comes to alternate versions of ourselves? Because again, everyone knew that this deep fake AI version of Yoon Suk-yeol was fake, and yet it still helped him get elected. So that's a really interesting point to me. I also think it's worth noting that for me, one of the main differentiations between pranks and social experiments versus performance art is the lack of consent from the people that accidentally end up participating in social experiments. So it's interesting to me that there was deception without any victims in Nico's grand reveal, meaning he didn't hurt anyone except himself with his performance art. Although some could argue that the ethics of mukbang content that sometimes problematically tends to border on feeder content are questionable, but that's a whole nother issue altogether. But what do you think?
I'm always 2 steps ahead.